We do welcome everyone to the Heritage Foundation, especially on this rather inclement weather day. We thank everyone that's joining us on the heritage.org website as well. Would ask everyone here in-house to make sure before we start that your cell phones have been turned off as a courtesy to our speakers and those recording our events. We will, of course, post the program within 24 hours on our Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. And as always, Internet viewers are always free to send comments or questions at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Ana Quintana. She is Research Associate for our Latin American Studies in the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science at Florida International University, as well as certificates in National Security and Latin American and Caribbean Studies. She studied in Brazil on a scholarship sponsored by the Defense Intelligence Agency. She's also completed a master's degree in global governance at Florida International University's School of International and Public Affairs. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, she worked at the Department of Defense as a student trainee. She also interned with International Relief and Development, working on Latin America rule of law issues, and with the U.S. Agency for International Development, working on civilian-military cooperation. Please join me in welcoming Ana Quintana. Ana?
Hi, good morning, and thank you all for braving the snow and joining us today, and the protesters too. Thanks for braving them. It's not often that Latin America is in the news, and when it is, you typically hear about cartel-related violence in Mexico, or drug trafficking in Colombia, or a stolen election in Venezuela. But between Mexico and South America, there is a forgotten region of Central America that has historically been of critical importance to U.S. national security. 4 out of these 7 countries are going to be electing new leaders, and El Salvador's elections are coming up now in February. And the country's precarious situation warrants a discussion on the candidates, the elections, and the stakes for the United States. The panelists have prepared remarks for us today. After the presentations, they will be taking questions from the audience. And rather than interrupting the presentations, I'll give you a quick note on their bios. Elliot Abrams is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Excuse me. He holds degrees from Harvard College, the London School of Economics, and Harvard Law School. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs in the Reagan administration and as Deputy National Security Advisor for Global Democracy Strategy in the administration of George W. Bush. He is a member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy and a member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Jose Cárdenas is a director in the Washington-based consulting firm Visión Américas. He has been working on inter-American relations in Washington for nearly 3 decades. During the George W. Bush administration, he served in senior positions at the State Department, the National Security Council, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. He is also a former senior staff member for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Dr. Juan José Daboob is the chairman and CEO of the Daboob Partnership. He is also the chairman of the World Economic Forum Council on Climate Change. He is the founding CEO of the Global Adaptation Institute and the former managing director of the World Bank Group. He was also the former Minister of Finance of El Salvador. As managing director of the World Bank Group from 2006 to 2010, Dr. Daboob oversaw operations in 110 countries in Africa, the Middle East, East Asia, and Latin America. He was also responsible for the oversight of the Human Development and Sustainable Development Networks, the Information Systems Group, the World Bank Institute, and the Department of Institutional Integrity. And Michael Braun is the managing director of SGI Global, a company focused on supporting U.S. and foreign government and private sector security and logistics projects around the globe, including in conflict and near post-conflict environments. Michael Braun retired from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration as Chief of Operations, Assistant Administrator, the number 3 at the agency, in 2008 after serving 33 years in law enforcement. Mr. Braun was the architect of the DEA's significant expansion in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2008, as well as other programs that targeted the drugs-terrorism nexus. Prior to this, Mr. Braun had extensive law enforcement experience in Latin America, leading specially trained and equipped teams of DEA special agents, host nation law enforcement officials, and U.S. military special forces on counter-narcotics operations in support of U.S. foreign policy. And now we're going to start it off with Dr. Daboob. Please help me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Anna, and good morning. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and for those who are listening and seeing us through the internet. I have prepared a few slides. I don't know. Yes. And the title attempts to describe what I think we have seen in the last 20 years or so in the history of my country, El Salvador, a country that was able to go from zero to hero and is currently being debating what is going to happen next. Let me give you 1 minute of history here. El Salvador was the scenario where the last war of the Cold War was fought. It was there where the Russians, where the Soviet Union attempted its last strike in America using Cuba and Nicaragua trying to take over El Salvador. They were not successful, in part thanks to the help of the United States and people like President Reagan, but also the Pope, John Paul II, who had influence in the region. The war was terrible. We lost about 5% of our population, and about 22% of our population migrated primarily to the United States. There was total destruction in the country, zero credibility, and very hard to attract investment. Poverty was skyrocketing, inflation was above 30%, unemployment above 12%. So all indicators, social, economic, and political, show a country that was in really bad shape, almost a basket case. However, we Salvadorians decided to stop blaming others for the problems that were ours, and we took destiny into our own hands. To start with, many of us who did not belong, like in my case, even though I was in government for 12 years, I never joined or belonged to any political party then or now. And there was a group of people like that that decided to, instead of just being observing what was going on, to actually try to help and revert that very, very terrible situation. So in a relatively short period of time, from 1992 to 1998, the peace agreements are signed in 1992. By 1998, 6 years later, El Salvador was already investment grade. We have reduced poverty by half, increased access to public services to most of the population, and regained the international credibility. In the year 2000, according to the Index of Economic Freedom produced by the Heritage Foundation and the Wall Street Journal, El Salvador reached the incredible and not seen again position of number 12 around the world. We have distributed copies of a publication of the Wall Street Journal in the year 2000. It is in Spanish, but you can also get the English version. And El Salvador in that year was able to beat not only Chile, but also Germany and South Korea. So if anybody has any doubts that economic freedom works, the best answer is that El Salvador was actually able to do it. Now, having said that, today, regrettably, we have lost almost 5 times the position we were 14 years ago. According to the Index of Economic Freedom, we are number 59 today. Why did that happen? Well, before I tell you what did that happen, let me say that we were the second country in Latin America to achieve the investment grade after Chile, then Mexico, then Peru, then Colombia. Many of the countries that are currently investment grade achieved the investment grade 3 to 5 years after El Salvador achieved that very important ranking. In terms of competitiveness, according to the World Economic Forum Index of Competitiveness that Michael Porter puts together, in the year 2003, 1 year before I finished my 12 years in government, we achieved one of the highest positions a Latin American country has achieved. We were next to New Zealand, to Chile, to Mexico. Yet today, we have come down below Vietnam and Botswana, and are at the levels of Zambia and Ghana. I have nothing against Zambia or Ghana. It's just that if you were next to New Zealand, you really regret to have lost so many positions. And take any indicators you want to take. The Transparency International indicator, the doing business that the World Bank puts together, the Index of Economic Freedom that we just discussed, and any of the other relevant indicators, and we have lost, as shown in the red column, several positions from where we were when things were done with discipline and with responsibility. Now, one would think that when you have populist governments from the right, like we did in the previous government, or the so-called socialism of the 21st century that we currently have, some people think that things will get better. So what has happened in this period of time is that taxes have increased. They have increased significantly, almost 11% annually. That means both the rate and the tax base, which puts us somewhere at the top in terms of the tax base in Latin America, just below Bolivia, Uruguay, and Chile. And in that same period, between 2004 and 2014, which is the new lost decade that we are now suffering, we have also increased the public debt. I think we are emulating what is happening here in the US. So from a healthy 46%, well below the agreement, the Maastricht Treaty, which is how things were left in 2004, to this year actually above 61%. So one probably has in mind that all of this has produced a lot of good for the country. And that is not the case. What it has produced is an increase in the hirings that have taken place in the public sector, some 21,000 new employees in the public sector. Just to give you a dimension here, when I was the Minister of Finance, we were able to reduce the public sector from 120,000 public servants to 90,000 public servants. We reduced it significantly. We eliminated ministries, we fused ministries, we of course privatized most of the state-owned enterprises to reduce poverty by half, to reduce inflation from 30% to 3%, to increase access to opportunities for people, access to public services, and to many other things that actually improve the way people live. When you go back to numbers that we haven't seen even before the war in terms of hirings in the public sector, we start to get very concerned. So what you hear from the populist, from the right or from the left, is that some of this money goes to the most needy people in the country. Well, in the case of El Salvador, the bottom 20% of the population got zero from the subsidies that have been implemented in the last 10 years. So that money has gone primarily to the bureaucracy that is not showing that competitiveness is increasing. It's just creating a much more bureaucratic country. The sad story is that in order to reduce poverty, you need to create jobs. The best tool against poverty is job creation, because that gives people the opportunity to actually own their destiny. Well, you cannot create jobs if the private sector is not active in a country, and if you don't have economic growth. As a consequence, last year we had one of the worst levels of economic growth. Actually, it was below 1.6. It was just reported at 1.4, and the projections for this year are not any healthier. What has happened with the then so-called main flag of many of the leftist and populist groups that we have in countries like mine, that poverty is going to be reduced? Well, it has actually increased in the last 10 years by more than 10% and about 25% total from the time that the reforms were done. So what I like to say as part of my closing remarks, and then I'll be happy to address any questions you might have, is that El Salvador is one of those cases that have proven that if you remove obstacles for people to take destiny into their own hands, when you stop blaming others for the problems that are yours, you can actually progress. When you adopt the right public policies, when you have economic freedom, countries do well. Actually, they do extremely well, like El Salvador have done. We went from hardship to investment grade in a relatively short period of time. We reduced poverty by more than 50%. Access to public services more than tripled. In many cases, like telecommunications, electricity, and water, is close to 100%. In telecommunications, is above 150%. And inflation, which is the worst tax you can impose on people, is thanks to the dollarization that we put into place as well, came down to about 3%. The populism from the right and the left that has really distorted the efforts the country had and distracted the effort from the path to progress that we have had in the last 10 years has meant that poverty has climbed almost 25%. Unemployment and underemployment are higher. Just today there is a publication from CEPAL in one of the Salvadorian newspapers, El Diario de Hoy, that shows that unemployment is about 16.2% last year, 2013. Those are numbers we have not seen in more than 20 years. Little or no foreign direct investment because of all the changes in the rules of the games, because of the excessive taxation, and because of the corruption that has arisen as a consequence of the weakening of institutions that have been taken for political purposes. And of course, higher levels of debt, which puts us in a very difficult position in terms of accessing to financing, becomes more expensive, or more importantly, what will happen to our children in the future. Now, what are the consequences of all of this for us, for the region, and for the U.S.? I think, as some of the other speakers probably will go into more details, I'm just going to leave what I think is obvious, but just in case it wasn't, briefly refer to them. First, there is the possibility of the Me Too effect. That is, other countries in the region, if they see things that we are doing that provide certain temporary popular support to the leaders, they might want to emulate that. I think we ended up emulating what Nicaragua did when they signed the pact between Ortega and Alemán. That's very similar to what the previous president and the current president in El Salvador agreed to do. So there is the possibility of emulating, regrettably, the bad experiences. Insecurity, as I think we will hear today, has gone to levels that we probably not even during the war saw. Drugs, of course, are a tremendous problem, as Mexico and Colombia have more effectively fought the drug cartels. These have migrated to Central America, primarily to Honduras and Guatemala, but also to El Salvador, and with the help of the gangs, which in the case of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, there are more members of gangs than the police and the military together, becomes the perfect combination for them. And if we add to that the fact that in my country, there are conversations between the institutions, that's the government, and the gangs that are in jail, that have already committed a crime, and they want to have a peace agreement, this will have effects on illegal immigration, and it is creating a platform for terrorism. You see faces in Central America that you didn't used to see before, from the same that are in Venezuela, Iranians, certain Chinese groups, Russians, and others, that were not the typical people present in the region. They are more and more coming and having missions and creating all kinds of business ventures, all under the umbrella of ALBA from Venezuela. So, I don't want to, believe it or not, I am an optimistic. I saw my country rising from total destruction, becoming one of the freest countries in the world, which translates into significant reduction and alleviation of poverty. It allows to create jobs. It put us really in the map of countries worth replicating and emulating. And I truly believe that it is within the Salvadorian people DNA, that capacity and ability to retake the path to progress. And we have in front of us a fantastic opportunity to retake that path that we lost in 2004. So I think that with the right leadership, the Salvadorian people will shine again in a sustainable and in a long-term fashion. Thank you very much.
And now please, we'll have Elliot Abrams. Thank you, Elliot.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here today, and I'll try to be brief since I've already done my part today. It's quite obvious, which was to attract the demonstrators. It's always nice to be remembered. I would just make one other preliminary comment, which is, the president just appointed Stanley Fischer, who'd been governor of the Bank of Israel, to be vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. It's an excellent use of international talent. And listening to the record of what El Salvador's economy achieved under Dr. Dabu, I'd like to have you come as Treasury Secretary next. See if we can produce numbers like that here. There are just a few things I'd like to say about the current challenge in El Salvador, just to put it in context. And there are several contexts to put it in. One of them is just the kind of thing that Dr. Dabu ended with, that is, Central Americans have been struggling in El Salvador and neighboring countries for decades and decades now to achieve decent, honest, democratic government for their countries. Many of them have died in that effort, and that effort certainly continues today. A second context is the continuing interference from outside. When I entered that scene during the Reagan administration, that outside role was being played by the Soviet Union and Cuba, which supported communist guerrilla groups like the FMLN in El Salvador and the FSLN, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And of course, they help each other when they could. In fact, it was the Sandinistas' intervention in El Salvador. They took over Nicaragua in '79. It was their intervention in El Salvador in 1980, 81, and after that so alarmed President Reagan and the United States about the nature of that regime and what they had planned for Central America. Today, the Soviets are gone. Of course, the Cubans are not. But the outside interference we're really worried about today is, of course, that of drug traffickers and criminal gangs, particularly from South America. They have effectively unlimited funds with which to bribe officials, threaten officials, with which to buy weapons for private armies. And while at times the United States could influence the activities of its rival, the USSR, because the relationship between the two superpowers then was a very complex one, there are no similar peaceful, democratic means of influencing the criminal groups. They have to be fought with the help of all the governments that we can enlist in that cause. And the third context is the transition from ideological to criminal organizations that we see happening on the extreme left. That this happened to the FARC is well known. In the FARC in Colombia, which now accounts for, according to the chief of police of Colombia, 60% of all of the cocaine being exported from Colombia, some years earning the FARC $500 million. If there is a FARC ideology today, it's probably opportunism. And this is what has happened in Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas are now a machine to seize and retain money and power for Sandinista leaders at the cost of democracy and human rights for all other Nicaraguans. And that is what we fear with the FMLN. I wrote an article about this in the Washington Post recently and noted actually something that we're going to hear about in more detail, so I won't spend much time on it, but FARC files reveal close ties between the FMLN leader, Jose Luis Moreno, who is really the right-hand man of the candidate for president, and the FARC. So you can understand why this has become an enormous danger. I quoted Michael Braun in that article saying there's enough information which clearly presents Moreno, Jose Luis Moreno, as someone with strong connections to the FARC. And I know he'll have more to say about that. Central America has the misfortune to be located between the suppliers of drugs and the market for drugs, and the market for drug being us in the United States. And now being caught between two countries that have a lot more resources and are engaged in a fight against drug trafficking, Colombia and Mexico. So the traffickers opportunistically migrate to Central America, where the opposition, which is to say honest officials, civilian, military, police, are weaker. And some, of course, are in league with the traffickers. In the case of the FMLN, we're seeing a shift to the left from what are within the FMLN comparatively more moderate forces to the more extreme, who happen also to be linked to criminals and to drug money. And that's no surprise, because what they all believe in is getting whatever they want at whatever cost and without regard to the interests of the people of the country. In other words, we run the risk of seeing all the gains for democracy in El Salvador squandered by men and women who have never believed in it, who fought it, who rejected it, except possibly as a means to power. To them, democracy was for decades an obstacle to be avoided and crushed, or now, perhaps, a tool to use to seize the government. And then you may be sure that once they seize it, they plan to keep it permanently. Like the Sandinistas, they follow the line, the edict that's attributed to Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey. Democracy is like a train, and when you get to your stop, you get off. That combination of money and ruthlessness, combined with the cover of ideology, is visible in Venezuela and Nicaragua, and those in power will do literally anything to avoid giving it up. They have no faith in democracy, both because they're not prepared to lose and leave power, and because they have contempt for democracy at the ideological level. The idealism that once motivated many people on the left, even the extreme left to some degree, has been withering since the fall of the Soviet Union. And instead, you have just a search for power and wealth. And then, of course, you have now the desire to stay in power permanently so that there will never be a serious investigation of the abuses that have been committed when they were in power. It's my hope that, as in Honduras, voters in El Salvador will reject that possible future. They will still face, all Central Americans will still face this terrible challenge from drug traffickers and their efforts to subvert these countries for criminal purposes. But at least they would know then that they have a government determined to work closely with the United States and other neighbors to defeat the criminals and turn them away and to build ever deeper and stronger democratic traditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. If you could now please join me in welcoming Michael Braun.
Thank you. I would like to start by thanking the Heritage for the invitation to participate on the panel this morning with my esteemed colleagues, and I'd also like to thank Hannah for all of your help in herding the proverbial cats. I know it's never easy, but let me start by saying that, folks, I'm not an academic, I'm not a diplomat, although I've worked with many diplomats in the past in some of my old positions at DEA. I am a career law enforcement professional that spent most of his years involved in international law enforcement and in my private sector days over the last 5 years in international security operations and supporting our government and other freedom-loving governments around the globe. So I'll be speaking to you from that perspective, if you will. I spent most of my career involved in overseeing very complex international organized crime and narco-terrorism conspiracy initiatives and projects and programs, involving also my directorship, if you will, of three interagency intelligence centers that were focused on transnational organized crime and narco-terrorism and terrorism efforts on behalf of our government. So I'll also be speaking to you from that perspective. I couldn't have asked for really kind of a better segue into the things that I'll be talking about than those provided to me by the two preceding presenters. Much of which has to do with what's happening in Central America, what's happening throughout Latin America, and what has been playing out for many years. That was captured perfectly, I believe, by Dr. Daoud when he said, "You're seeing faces in Central America and Latin America today that you didn't see just a few years ago, and faces that had never been seen before in that part of the world." Most terror experts believe that as a result of 9/11, we entered a long war. And I believe that all of my colleagues up here with me would also, I don't want to speak for any of them, but I believe they're with me. I believe we are in a long war. So many of the 4 stars within our joint military services that I know and that I've had many discussions with believe that we're going to be fighting this war for decades, much like we did with the Cold War. And that also has a part to play in, I believe, what we're seeing throughout much of Latin America, and also what we're seeing play out in El Salvador. Let me start by reminding everyone that Salvador Sánchez Cerén's right-hand man, Jose Moreno, his email communications were discovered on Raul Reyes's laptop computer after the Colombian military and national police successfully conducted a raid and an attack which ultimately resulted in Reyes's death. Reyes was the head of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, which is, folks, a designated terrorist organization by our country, by the European Union, and by many other countries around the globe. They are also, not in my words, these are the words of the president of Colombia when he was the head of when he was the Minister of Defense, that the FARC has evolved, as Mr. Abrams said, has evolved from a group, a designated terrorist organization that was principally driven by ideology for much of its life. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the drying up of that funding stream from the Soviet Union into Cuba, downward into groups like the FARC, the Sendero Luminoso, FMLN, and others, when that dried up almost overnight, the FARC Executive Secretariat made a strategic decision. They had to get into the cocaine trade if they were going to keep the movement alive because the money dried up. Admiral Jim Stavridis, the former commander of Southcom, testified before Congress that virtually every challenge that he faced in Latin America in his area of responsibility was fueled by corruption, or that could be linked directly to corruption. And that corruption was being fueled by the international drug trade and and that it was, again, causing virtually every, or was a result of virtually every challenge that he was facing in Latin America. I would also tell you that every one of his successors has been preaching very much the same thing. What's happening in El Salvador? What's happening in El Salvador is part of greater picture, and I think that that's what we have to be thinking about as we discuss El Salvador today. We can't think of it as El Salvador centric, if you will. Look at what's happened post 9/11 throughout Latin America. Venezuela, Venezuela we lost well over a decade ago. Ecuador will probably be next. Look at what's happened in Bolivia. Look at what's happened in Nicaragua. I happen to believe we're seeing the same thing, out of the same playbook. We'll see the same thing happen in El Salvador if Sanchez happens to be elected, if he's fortunate enough to be elected. What troubles me is that we as a nation don't seem to be doing much about it. No one is speaking out like we used to speak out. Other than panels like this, no one from our government is taking the leadership to speak out about what's happening in Latin America. Some things that you also need to understand is that after 9/11, over 60% of our nation's detection and monitoring assets left theater, went elsewhere in the world, and they've never returned. And we all understand why. But what I don't understand is why they've never returned. Why don't we have a focus, on our neighborhood? And that term may not be politically correct, but it is very much part of our neighborhood. And what concerns me about El Salvador is if Sanchez is elected, the wolf just gets one step closer to our door. We need to wake up and understand what's happening in Latin America, and we need to re-engage and start to turn this around. Because if we don't, I believe we're in very, very deep trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And last but definitely not least, Jose Cardenas.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. And I, too, would like to thank Heritage Foundation for the invitation, Anna specifically, to be here and to share this panel with such distinguished colleagues. It's clear that anybody with a passing interest in Latin America knows the terrible toll that narcotics trafficking is taking on the people of Central America. Their misfortune is to be stuck geographically between two much larger and stronger countries, Mexico and Colombia, that have employed their far more prodigious resources and higher capacities to take the war to the drug cartels, effectively forcing them out of those locales to find more hospitable and accommodating environments for their criminal activities. And where they have gone, of course, is relocated to the Central America Isthmus. I would also say that, to pick up on where Mike was going, is that also their misfortune is to have an American administration for which, to the extent that they think anything about Latin America, let alone Central America, they are uncomfortable about supporting the hard side, what is called the hard side of counter-narcotics policy. That means providing these countries with the military and law enforcement hardware to confront the cartels. And this is, of course, in combination with the so-called soft side of counter-narcotics policy. We're talking about institutional reforms and targeted economic assistance. But they do have a reluctance about employing the hard side because lest they be accused by professional activists on the left of remilitarizing Central America, as if the criminals have not already done a good job of doing that by themselves. Make no mistake about it, there is no solution to the problems we face in the region without weapons and training. Under the Central American Regional Security Initiative, goes by the name of CARSI, which is an offshoot of the Merida Initiative, which in itself is a George W. Bush initiative. The Obama administration, since 2009, has obligated around $500 million worth of training equipment and technical assistance, as they describe it, to increase the capacity of law enforcement, strengthen institutions, promote the rule of law and human rights, and address the root causes of the crisis in Central America. That aid, however, has been consistently stalled and delayed for myriad reasons, including lack of absorptive capacity in the region and political opposition from some quarters in the U.S. Congress. That's on our side of the ledger. Downrange, these governments are simply outgunned and outspent and are no match for the brutality of the drug cartels. Indeed, the latter's use of their unlimited cash to penetrate governments and political systems allows them to undermine democratic institutions and derail reform efforts of the police and security forces. There is no silver bullet to the challenges faced by Central America, but we have no choice but to engage and engage fully. The escalating drug criminality is having a dreadful impact on the social, political, and economic systems of these countries and is undermining key U.S. strategic interests in the Western Hemisphere. Not only is the health of our own society being put at risk by drug consumption and drug trafficking, but so is our border security, not to mention the pressures that regional insecurity places on our own immigration process. But if there is no silver bullet, there are indeed at least two bedrock requirements for any effective counter-narcotics and security policies. The first, I'll quote Bill Brownfield, our Assistant Secretary of State for INL, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, as he put it in congressional testimony last summer, quote, having trusted partners is vital to combating criminal groups in the region. Secondly, both our partners, and this is me talking, both our partners and we need to have the political will to see the struggle through to the end. And that brings me to this morning's discussion. As we have heard, El Salvador holds an election February 2nd, and the two candidates could not be more opposite in their visions and views towards the United States. Now, the Salvadorian people will make their own judgments as to which candidate offers the more convincing platform for leading the country into the future. But I also believe it is entirely legitimate for us today to be discussing how that election will impact our bilateral cooperation on security and narcotics policies in the region. Our cooperation on these fronts is not insignificant. Good resources for gauging the breadth and depth of our security and economic cooperation with El Salvador can be found on the website Just the Facts, which tracks U.S. security assistance in Latin America. Now, it's always a challenge to figure out how much assistance precisely in dollars goes to El Salvador, U.S. assistance, because the money comes from so many different accounts. But suffice it to say that the country receives about 17%. El Salvador receives about 17% of all CARSI funding, which I mentioned exceeded $500 million up until 2002. And that 17% comes out to something about $85 million. For fiscal year 2014, Obama administration requested about $161.5 million for CARSI, meaning the entire region. Yet, also under a Partnership for Growth program, the U.S. also delivered another $91 million to El Salvador to upgrade its security architecture. These funds support a wide range of activities, training police forces and providing counter-narcotics assistance, training prosecutors, investigators, judges on prosecuting organized crime and money laundering cases, helping to modernize police academies' curriculum, establishing transnational anti-gang units that investigate groups like MS-13 and M-18 that cover the cross-border links between gangs, including into U.S. cities. El Salvador is also home to the U.S.-supported International Law Enforcement Academy, ILEA, which provides training to police, prosecutors, and other officials from across Latin America. That facility trained approximately 900 Central Americans in 2012. El Salvador also hosts a key forward operating location, which U.S. personnel use to monitor and deter drug trafficking in the region. U.S. Agency for International Development also has a range of programs they support that affect the security situation. And we're talking about anti-gang programs, meaning rehabilitation, reinsertion, reintegration of gang members, as well as a range of other neighborhood policing programs. So it is complex, it is wide-ranging, and it is deep. But given our security interests in El Salvador, it is imperative that we have trusted partners to work with, that also have the political will and share our goals and commitment to peace, stability, and the rule of law. And that is key because there are alarming signs that criminals and drug traffickers are also claiming a stake in El Salvador's election with the overt complicity of the ruling party's hardliners. 4 years ago, the FMLN was able to capture the presidency in El Salvador by putting forward a relative moderate candidate, Mauricio Funes. But this time around, clearly there is no pretense. The candidate today is from the former, is a hardened ex-guerrilla who has remained true to the movement's ideology when they were fighting in the field. And he and his hardline faction of the party believe now it is their time to wield power. And I think that to go back to what Elliot said, this is more than about ideology. It is about power and wealth and acquiring it. And in this case, what is so troubling about El Salvador are the long-standing associations with others that continue to employ violence for ostensibly political ends, and in this case, the drug trafficking FARC in Colombia, which Elliot mentioned, and Michael, that is the largest drug conspiracy in the Western Hemisphere. And Michael mentioned the links between the high-ranking FMLN operative José Luis Merino with the FARC. And this is how, based on the results of the analysis of the Raul Reyes computers, this is how one Latin American journalist, veteran Latin American journalist from the Wall Street Journal, José de Córdoba, after analyzing it, he said the documents show, quote, documents show that the FARC has an international support network stretching from Madrid to Mexico City, Buenos Aires to Bern. Merino, the documents suggest, is a key link in the international chain, the FARC's man in El Salvador, and one of the architects of an arms deal that includes everything from sniper rifles to ground-to-air missiles, end quote. And that José Luis Merino continues his criminal associations was exposed recently, and this was in Elliot's article, by the respected Spanish newspaper ABC, which revealed how Merino arranged passage to Venezuelan territory through the office of the Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro for a reputed member of the Italian mafia to meet with representatives of the FARC. Clearly, anybody with such a dubious background as Merino should be so close, or the potential to be so close to the levers of power in El Salvador, is not only ominous for that country, but also for the United States and our interest. It defies explanation why Merino hasn't been indicted or otherwise sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department for his ties to the narco-terrorist FARC or his involvement in drug trafficking. After all, the Treasury Department has designated several Venezuelan military officials as drug kingpins for their complicity in aiding and assisting the FARC. Individuals such as Jose Luis Moreno, with individuals like that so close to potential next president of El Salvador, raises serious questions about the future of our bilateral security and counter-narcotics cooperation, and by extension, our broader effort in the region, because the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. I don't think we as a country do anyone any favors when we remain silent in the face of criminal wrongdoing. In fact, I say we owe it to our partners in the region to speak out. The Obama administration should be more active in defending rule of law and demonstrating more visible solidarity with the people of Central America who are now seeing the hard fought-for gains of the past 3 decades being undermined by this new face of criminality and corruption. Before I finish, I just wanted to pick up on something Michael said, and that is in the case of losing ground. I mean, folks, let's look what have happened in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, where we saw what happened when these radical populists come to power. One of the immediate targets is the DEA. They expel them from the country. And what happens is, frankly, the bad guys immediately move in. In Venezuela, Michael mentioned what is it? We have lost Venezuela. In Bolivia, ask the Brazilians how they feel about Bolivia's counter-narcotics policies today. President Evo Morales is a former coca grower. Brazil is awash in Bolivian cocaine. Ecuador, a former U.S. official once called Ecuador the United Nations of crime because of all of the criminal groups that are arriving there to take advantage of lax counter-narcotics policies. So the precedent is there. We're not just conjuring up fears. We have seen what has happened elsewhere in the region where these radical populists come to power. So in wrapping up, let me just say 2 things, ladies and gentlemen. Effective policies based on trust and political will with our partners. And those are the 2 essentials to confronting the challenges before us. Thank you very much.
Now we're going to open up the floor for questions from the audience, and I'd actually like to ask the first question. So on February 2nd, Costa Rica is also going to have their elections as well, and the OAS has decided to send an observation mission to Costa Rica rather than El Salvador. The OAS has also decided to attend CELAC on neutral territory in Cuba. As we all know, it's going to be now at the end of this month. What reforms do you think need to be instituted within the OAS, or what do you see as the future of the United States' ability to exert any sort of influence within the OAS? As to any one of you who would like to.
Well, I think that for starters, we need a new U.S. administration. I really don't think there is enough time to really re-engage. I mean, I would love to see it, but it's clear that after 6 years, you do get a pretty good idea of where the region lies on the pecking order of the White House, and I think it ranks somewhere near Oceania and Antarctica. But I think that this has had the result of seeing the drifting away of the region from partnership with the U.S., from an interest in partnership, and it has had very dire results for democracy in the region. I think that the idea that we're going to have a regional meeting of democracies in Cuba this month, and I don't expect to see it used as a forum to demand reforms from the Castro regime. I think that that is just a travesty. I think it's a travesty for the cause of democratic consolidation in the region. The idea that the OAS is sending a monitoring mission to Costa Rica and ignoring El Salvador again is just another manifestation of just a lack of seriousness and just drift, frankly.
All right.
I agree with that. I think the critical ingredient here is U.S. leadership. There has been some leadership, but often in the wrong direction. And the best example of that is a couple of years ago in Honduras, where the United States essentially took what I would call the wrong side in Honduras. And that was certainly a signal to people throughout the region. I think if there were American leadership, there'd be a number of recruits in the region, democratic governments that see the dangers. Dangers from crime, dangers on the extreme left, and would be willing to work with us, but it's simply not there.
Just a quick comment. In the last year, there have been at least 3 missions, if I'm not mistaken, from the OAS to El Salvador, including the Secretary General. Just 2 weeks ago, they were again in El Salvador to meet with the gangs. And so it will be very surprising that they actually send people and invest resources to meet with the gangs and not to actually do what little legitimacy they still have in terms of monitoring elections.
Just, you mentioned Costa Rica specifically. Historically, Costa Rica was the golden child of Central America. For the most part, levels of corruption were far less than any other country in the region. They had strong law enforcement, judicial institutions, and this is, I believe, what's happening in Costa Rica now is just further proof of this pattern, this expanding pattern of activity. You have organized crime that's influenced Costa Rica now at levels never seen before. You have drugs pouring into the country. You have other forms of transnational organized crime that are playing out. The entire judicial system has been weakened significantly. Again, going back to corruption and what drug trafficking and transnational criminal activity brings with it. Organized crime, the hallmarks of organized crime have always been and will always be corruption, intimidation, and violence. If they can't corrupt you, they'll turn to intimidation, a form of corruption, just kick it up a notch, and if that doesn't work, they'll resort to extreme violence. And again, it's a very troubling sign, because now that we're seeing that same kind of activity in Costa Rica, to me, it's even more worrying.
Thank you. Anyone in the audience?
Dr. Dambu, you mentioned corruption, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on the nature of corruption in El Salvador, and more generally speaking, in countries where corruption is really sabotaging chances for economic growth around the world. What would you say is the best way to combat that?
As I show in one of the slides, using the Transparency International indicators, or for that matter, the World Governance indicators that Danny Kaufman produces, regrettably, El Salvador has declined significantly in terms of, or has actually increased in terms of corruption. In general, and this is something that after having worked in 110 countries and having seen the different phases of corruption, I think that the primary source of corruption is a large government. In other words, when you have 60 or 80% of the activity in a country being your money, your taxes, being used for many things in the country, then the opportunities for corruption are much bigger. And so one of the ways of addressing corruption is significantly reducing the size of the state to its natural dimension. And what is the natural dimension of a state? States were created for one primary purpose, to provide security to the citizens. Everything else that has arisen through time in many shapes and forms in terms of services and all of these activities governments provide are really not necessarily for the good of the people. And each of those open up the opportunities for corruption. So corruption can be combated by, first, reducing the size of the state. Second, by strengthening institutions, the institutions that can actually investigate, persecute, and if found guilty, kept where you need to be kept. And third, it is important to recognize that it takes two to tango. Corruption wouldn't exist if there wouldn't be a government official willing to receive a bribe in order to facilitate some kind of permit of paperwork that needs to take place, and someone from the private sector or civil society, for that matter, that is willing to pay in order for that service to be provided faster. And so we need to be conscious of all of those weaknesses that exist, and the way to start fixing it is reducing the size of the state, strengthening institutions, creating as much competition as possible in all services that are provided in a country, so that there is less room to have to go to a friend. I used to be the president of the telephone company, and at that time, this is between 1996 and 1998, there were only 3 telephones per 100 inhabitants. Today there are 150 per 100 inhabitants. When there were 3 telephones per 100 inhabitants, there were only 3 ways you can get a telephone line. One was if you knew the head of the union. Okay? 2, if you knew the president of the company, which for many years was a retired general. Or 3rd, if you were willing to pay up to $2,400 in the black market to get a telephone line. I got one of the first phone calls I got when I was the president of the telephone companies was from Shafiq Handal, the former Secretary General of the Communist Party. He called me to ask for a telephone line. And I said, well, there is this, there's the mechanism through which you can, with your neighbor, share a telephone line, because there was no other way to get a new telephone line. But that's just to say what happens when you have monopolies run by the public sector, and when you have all the bureaucracies that you can have in order to provide a service. That's where the opportunities for corruption exist.
If I can add one point on the issue of corruption, it's important to make a distinction that, the region has always known corruption. Corruption is something that exists all over the world, obviously. But to pick up a point that Michael made is that you have corrupt countries, and then you have corruption in countries, and then you have countries that have been penetrated by transnational criminal organizations, which elevates it's corruption on steroids. And it is a type of corruption that bleeds, that it's a cancer that spreads throughout the system. It undermines institutions, it distorts the judiciary system, it exacerbates all of the shortcomings of the judiciaries in these countries that are still evolving, developing, and it leads to a degree of impunity so that the average citizen basically loses all faith in democracy. That is the big risk of the drug-fueled corruption that we see in some of these countries in Latin America.
If I could add just a couple of things. The doctor mentioned that one of the most important things that needs to be done, I think was number 2, was strengthening institutions, security institutions. And I couldn't agree more, but we have to consider one thing. To do that, you have to have willing legislators that are willing to pass laws and establish laws that will allow law enforcement, prosecutors, the courts, and the prisons to successfully and effectively investigate, indict, arrest, ultimately try and then hopefully convict and lock up organized crime. Without that, it's simply not going to work. And in most Latin American countries, those countries do not enjoy the tools that law enforcement has in our country. Very powerful international, extraterritorial conspiracy jurisdictions, laws and jurisdictions, the ability to conduct complex undercover operations, the ability to conduct judicially approved wiretaps or telecommunications operations, all of those things that law enforcement has in place here in the United States and in a few other countries to get the job done with respect to attacking organized crime. What I would say is most of those, most countries in Latin America simply don't have those tools. They've never had them. It's also important to understand too that, listen, organized crime, the very powerful Colombian and Mexican drug trafficking organizations, including the FARC, I go back to that, also a designated terrorist organization that has remarkably strong ties to groups like Hezbollah and more Al-Qaeda and some other groups. They are investing not millions or tens of millions of dollars each year, but hundreds of millions of dollars at corrupting governments and countries across the world. They are creating permissive environments in which they can operate with impunity and freely. And if we don't get that in check, we are in trouble. Because Hezbollah, as one example, Hezbollah, a designated terrorist organization, and guys very professional or professionals like Mike Chertoff and Bob Mueller and some others that I had the opportunity to work with, they've testified before Congress. Al-Qaeda is a threat. We shouldn't take our eye off of them for a minute. But the real threat is Hezbollah. Al-Qaeda could only hope to have someday the capacity that Hezbollah's got. Hezbollah is now involved in the global cocaine trade. They are all over Latin America as a result of that activity. And what are they doing? They're developing close relationships with the most powerful organized crime entities the world has ever known or has ever faced, the Mexican and Colombian cartels. Strategically, that adds a great deal to the Hezbollah's capacity to attack us at some point when things really go bad with Iran.
Well, thank you very much for the terrific presentation. Thank you, Anna, for bringing this all together. This may sound rather bizarre, but on this specific point, there's a fellow who's a Venezuelan diplomat, great Venezuelan name, Ghazi Atef Nasruddin Abu Ali. He's was the number 2 in their embassy in Damascus. And yesterday, I know he tweeted to me about 10 or 12 tweets commenting upon, he says, what do you have to say now about Iran? By the way, he's a Hezbollah activist. What do you have to say about Iran now that President Obama is praising them and cutting them slack? You could go read the timeline. So they watch this stuff. And the message that our lack of attention has sent in Central America and our neutrality between a decent mainline traditional political party that has been traditionally pro-American and a former guerrilla, armed guerrilla who was present at the burning of the American flag in the wake of 9/11. The fact that we're neutral sends an extraordinary message throughout the region. And it's being read by the criminals also in Colombia and in Mexico. And even by our allies, these messages are being read in Colombia and Mexico. Or in Colombia, you have the president, Juan Manuel Santos, prepared to sign a peace agreement with a narco-trafficking organization, a terrorist narco-trafficking organization, because he feels that the United States doesn't have his back anymore. And in Mexico, where they have a de facto truce with the narcos, and in the last 13 months, it's shown how much it's gotten out of hand, where they finally had to take over the scary situation in Michoacan because the president could no longer ignore it. So lest we think there's no way we can help on this, I know that there is bipartisan support in Congress. There's a growing awareness, in some cases, very active engagement on the issue, but we need to see more of that. And I would encourage everyone to reach out to those members of Congress who are responsible for this, not only for the foreign policy side, but for the law enforcement side, to see if they're, to have that sort of oversight, to see that the DEA has the resources that it needs to do the work, to see why are we neutral between a narco-trafficking organization, terrorist organization, and a decent democratic political party in El Salvador. Why isn't Jose Luis Merino subject to sanctions, law enforcement sanctions? So you have this thin blue line, law enforcement, mostly the DEA at the point, and members of Congress. And I just ask the panelists if they have any comment on how the American people who are listening to this can encourage those who are willing to do something about this issue to do more.
I think that one way I would start to answer that is when you ask, invariably, when you see any polls throughout Latin America, and they ask citizens what is their biggest concern, it's personal security. It's the ability to walk safe streets at night. If you ask the Obama administration, they think the biggest threat in the region is global warming. I mean, we have to do a better job as a government in aligning our policy with what the rank and file, the average citizen of Latin America, what's important to them, and that is safe streets, safe neighborhoods, reducing the influence of gangs in Central America. Obviously, what goes without saying is diminishing the impact of organized crime in their countries. So, unfortunately, when we look at our own country and we see what's going on in places like Colorado and the state of Washington about decriminalization of marijuana use, that hurts. That hurts our effort. I think that back in the day, I remember when the ONDCP, the arm of the White House drug control policy, would expend resources to fund public information campaigns about how our leisurely consumption of drugs in the United States impacted the lives of people not very far from here, across the border, as a matter of fact. So I think that but that's not helped. It's not helped either by the president's somewhat wishy-washy words recently on marijuana consumption. So I believe that we really do need more of a public ad campaign in the United States to convince or to educate the population, educate the people to see, to understand what the negative impact is of these of this, again, this leisurely drug consumption. It has very real consequences for people's lives. That's how I would respond.
Just a couple of other comments is, one of our problems, I believe, is we remain obsessed with continuing to develop strategies on top of strategies that are very much designed to protect or to guard the 1 yard line, the southwest border. We've dumped billions into our southwest border. It's not much more secure today than it was 10 years ago. When you are dealing with the world's most technically advanced, most savvy organized crime entities, again, that the world's ever faced, they're going to find a way under, around, over, or through any border that you put in front of them because they're motivated by one thing and one thing only, money. It's what drives them. So what we've got to do is we've got to develop defense in depth strategies, like we used to have, quite frankly, when a couple of you were serving, at least in prior administrations. We have got to get back to defense in depth strategies. I'd much rather know about a threat when it's 500 or 1,000 or 3,000 miles out than when it's literally on our border, or God forbid, has successfully compromised our border and made it somewhere into the United States, Detroit, Chicago, wherever. We've got to get back to that mentality. And one thing for sure is the DEA cannot do it alone. Our military's ability to work with, and they worked hard over many, many years to develop lasting, enduring relations with other military forces throughout Latin America. Many of those relationships have dried up in many of the countries that we've already talked about. Most of our detection and monitoring assets, again, are gone. So we've somehow got to revitalize defense in-depth strategies. And then lastly, what we've got to do is develop interlocking counter-narcotics and counterterrorism strategies. As the bad guys are growing closer and closer together, as we continue to experience this convergence or confluence of drugs and terror and transnational criminal organizations, as the bad guys grow closer together, we drift further apart. We've got agencies in this town that, after all of these years, have counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism responsibilities, yet the two don't talk. And it gets even worse when you go outside of individual agencies or departments. It gets even worse. Not long ago, I saw a draft State Department strategy, I hope it changed, draft strategy on counter-narcotics in Latin America. You couldn't find the term counterterrorism. You couldn't find the word terrorism anywhere in the document. To me, ladies and gentlemen, that is absolutely shameful.
If I may answer Ambassador Noriega, something that I think can be done, emulating or replicating what in the 80s and 90s was done with a certain degree of success. I think it's very important for organizations like the Heritage Foundation and others that share the values of freedom, not only within the United States but abroad, to not only do activities like this, but go to the next stage, which would be to actually engage with as many members of Congress as possible, given that, as we have heard, perhaps the administration has other priorities at this stage. But to go to Congress and approach those who are interested and have shown interest in Latin America and in El Salvador in the past, whether because they have today 2.5 million Salvadorians here in the United States, 75% of which vote, and therefore their voice is important in their constituencies, but at the same time, because there are funds from the United States that continue to go to El Salvador, and you want to make sure that those resources are not stolen or are not misused for purposes different than the intended destination. And so I'll give you one example. Just late last year, Senator Lehigh, a Democrat, was very concerned about the use of the Millennium Challenge account in El Salvador and was asking questions. And his questions actually proved to be very strong messages in El Salvador to put the house in order in certain areas that our politicians were misbehaving. So the power of a U.S. senator or congressman that can say, he or she, a congressman or a senator, do not have the power to, for example, take away the visa of Merino or whomever is involved in some of these activities that have been mentioned here, but could say, I want to review the policies that are being put forward in terms of who is coming to my country. I also want to review to whom the remittances that are going to El Salvador is actually going to. So if a statement from a congressman or a senator takes place, this goes farther and stronger in El Salvador than it goes here, for sure, and it's actually taken very seriously. So sometimes a little effort to actually just bring truthful information, facts, to members of Congress, and hopefully they taking interest and just expressing a view or asking for the information to the administration, and to the extent that they can do it to El Salvador as well, I think can go a long way.
I would just, this would be my last intervention because I have to run downtown, but I do want to thank Heritage for convening this panel. I just wanted to follow up on that because I fully agree with that. The question that Ambassador Noriega asked is, of course, a very interesting one. How do we have an impact on a foreign election that concerns us a lot without intervening in the election, without doing something that members of Congress, who after all are politicians who run for election, don't like, which is the United States government saying vote for this guy and not for that guy. And I think really you've given the answer. There are many ways of showing what our views, our hopes, our fears are. One of them is simply defending democracy and defending constitutionalism. We had an opportunity to do that in Honduras a couple years ago, and we were on the wrong side. That is, we defended Zelaya rather than defending the Constitution of Honduras and the Supreme Court of Honduras and the desires of the people of that country to maintain their democracy. So that's one thing you can do. When someone is acting in an unconstitutional, extra-constitutional manner, then it is easy for the United States to have a basis for speaking out very loudly. And there are many other ways, as you said, to send messages. Members of Congress, just by the questions they ask. The spokesmen of the White House and the State Department, by the questions and comments they make. As you noted, Congress can't make those designations, but the executive branch can. And the timely designation of an individual who, after all, is not running for office. It isn't as if, you're designating a candidate 3 weeks before the election. The designation of people who deserve to be designated on the merits sends a very strong message to voters. And then they have to make up their own minds. And all we can do is express our views about the relationship of individuals to the laws of their own country, to the laws of the United States, and prospectively to the impact of certain outcomes on bilateral relations. And then you live with the result of a fair election. But certainly there are a lot of people in El Salvador who would like to know these facts, and we're not doing them any favors if we adopt a form of neutrality that keeps us silent about these kinds of activities. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, in the interest of time, I just want to thank the panelists again, Jose, Mike, Elliot, Juan, thank you again, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.